Chess. The goal is to take your opponent's king. So this is the king here on e1 and e8. I'm going to be giving you moves in the forms of coordinates. As you can see here, there's a coordinate line all the way drawn across the bottom of the board, running from A through H and 1 through 8. The first few times you hear these, you're probably going to see yourself counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But usually people catch on with that pretty quick. So my guess is by the end, you'll already be pretty good at just seeing which square. So these are the kings, and the goal is to take your opponent's king. Now, that generally doesn't happen very fast. There's a whole lot of other things going on. So the way each piece moves, pawns. These are the soul of chess. They represent half of the guys you were given at the start of the game, and there are 8 of them. So they are allowed to move 1 square forward, or if it's their first move, 2 squares forward. So for example, here, this pawn could play to c3, or it could play to c4. But since it's already moved now, it can only move 2 squares forward the first time it moves. So from here, if black were to do something like this, we could play c5, but we could not push the pawn all the way to c6 because the pawn can only move 1 square at a time once it is moved. Pawns capture diagonally. So if these pawns were staring at each other, you might think, well, they could just move forward. This one will go take that pawn. But no, that's not how it works. Pawns only can capture in a diagonal straight line like this. So for example, if white were to play the move d4 here, this pawn on d4 could take white's pawn because it's capturing diagonally. If a pawn makes it all the way to the edge of the board, these moves are all very unrealistic. But if it makes it all the way to the edge of the board, it can promote and turn into a new piece. So for example here, what white could do is take black's knight, and then his pawn will become a new piece. Now, you almost always want to make a queen, because the queen's the most powerful piece. My guess is it will just make a queen automatically without giving me an option. Yeah, it just made a queen. So that's pawns. Knights. These are the trickiest piece to remember, but they are important too. These knights, they move in an L shape, which is 2 and then 1. So for example, this knight can move up, could move up 2 and over 1 like this, or up 2 and over 1 like that. So these are the 2 squares that this knight would go to. The knights are the only pieces that can jump over a piece. So for example, here we can see that even though our pawn on g2 is in the way, the knight could reach one of these squares. So for example, this is a totally acceptable move. The knight also doesn't have any special captures. It captures the exact same way it moves. So for example, if black were to play e5 here, this knight could go up 2 and 1 and take this pawn. Knights are generally better placed in the center. I mean, most pieces are, but knights in particular, because if you can imagine this knight, you think about all the squares that it's controlling. When it's in the center, it is going to control 8 different squares. While, for example, if it's on the side of the board like this, the knight here is only looking at 4 different squares. So because it sort of shoots in all directions, it's much better off placed in the center. And because it's a short-range piece, putting it on the side of the board means that it's not going to be wildly helpful. So next up, bishops. These guys are very different than the knight, but they are approximately equal in terms of their overall power. The bishop can move in a diagonal line as far as it wants. So, and it can't jump over pieces. So for example, let's take this position here. This bishop could move to e2, d3, c4, or b5, taking the pawn. But it could not come all the way to a6 over the pawn on b5, because that would involve jumping over a piece. But here, for example, white could comfortably capture this pawn, while it would be a mistake for white to come here to put the bishop here, because now this pawn, which captures diagonally, could take it. Rooks. Exactly the same as the bishop, except straight lines. So it doesn't move diagonally, it moves in a straight line. So for example here, this rook could now go to either of these squares. Let's say after rook h3, this rook could now swing along anywhere along this rank that it wishes. Rooks are generally more powerful than bishops because it's better to be able to move in a straight line than a diagonal line. Because if we consider this bishop on f1 here, for example, no matter what you do for the rest of this game, this bishop will only ever operate on a white square. If there's something important going on a black square, this bishop will never be able to help out in that regard, because no matter what you do, whenever you're moving diagonal, you're staying on the white squares the entire game, while a rook can, in theory, go to any color square that it wishes. There's no square on the board that this rook can't reach some way or another. It's very easy for the rook to go wherever it wants. The queen is your most powerful piece. And this is basically a cross between the rook and the bishop. So in a position like this one, the queen can go as far as it wishes in any direction, straight or diagonal. So for example, the queen could come here, and now this queen could go to any of these squares that it wishes. These are all possible moves. The queen is the most powerful piece that you have. The king is just like the queen in that it can move in any direction, but it can only move one square at a time. So for example, here, the only move for white's king would be coming up this way. Now, this would be an egregiously bad move because the whole goal of the game is not to get your king captured, and running your king up into the center of the board while simultaneously blocking in this bishop from developing, blocking your queen from developing. It would be a very bad move for white to make, but in theory, it's possible. Finally, there's a little trick called castling, which is that if you have, if there's nothing in between your king and your rook, and you haven't moved either your king or your rook, what your king can do is do this little thing where it moves 2 squares toward the rook, and then the rook will jump over it like that. So it's always king 2 squares toward the rook, and then the rook lands on the other side. You could do it on the other side as well. For example, if we had something like this, let's say, once white has cleared away this entire row here, he can move his king again 2 squares towards his rook, and then his rook will jump over it to the other side. So that's, and this is a valuable thing to do because this, for example, will allow white's rook to become more centralized, which might help him push this pawn forward with the rook's support. And now the king is sort of going to be hid away in the corner of the board where it will be hard for black to get at it. So the whole goal is to take your opponent's king. So for example here, let's start with just a very basic trick. Let's say we have this position here. It's white to play. How can we go take our opponent's king? You can feel free to type it in the chat or just turn on your microphone, whatever you wish. Yes, Dean Barclay. So Dean Barclay has pointed out the move queen takes f7. And the point is that this move, white's queen has gone down and taken this pawn. It is attacking black's king, because the queen can move in a diagonal line. The king cannot go here or here, as the queen controls both of those squares. And white's bishop is defending the queen, which means black can't take it. This is called checkmate. The king is lost and the game is over. But this is a very basic way for white to play. He's basically saying, I hope black is too stupid to realize that queen takes f7 is coming, and that he's threatening to checkmate me. And if black were to, for example, play something like knight f6, this blocks white's queen from reaching that square, and now all white has done is basically wasted time. This is basically just playing for a trick, and oh, my opponent didn't fall for it. Oops, now my position is unpleasant. So that kind of thing sort of works among 7-year-old kids, but usually in more adult games is not seen too often. The last thing I want to go over before we get started with the game at hand is value of material. So evaluating which trade is going to be good for you. So if we use the pawn as a base, a pawn is worth 1 point. So let's say, sorry, get rid of that. If a pawn is worth 1 point, knights and bishops are both worth 3. So for example, if you can take 3 pawns, but your opponent gets a bishop, that's about an equal trade. Rooks are worth 5 points. So for example, if you get a bishop and 2 pawns and your opponent has a rook, that's an equal trade. If you get a bishop and 1 pawn and your opponent has a rook, that's a bad trade for you. Things like this. And then the queen is worth 9 points. So just remember, pawn is worth 1, bishop and knight is worth 3, rook is worth 5, and queen is worth 9. This will help you evaluate which trades are good for you and which are not. So that's sort of the basic overview of how to play chess and the most basic elements of understanding material balances. If there are any questions about this, please